All right, so as we wrap up units 5 and 6 in this course, there's a couple things I want to remind everybody of, and I don't really have the class period to be able to do that. So here's my opportunity to speak with you a little bit more personally. Number one, this unit involved a lot of new stuff, but also bringing together some old things that we've learned. And I want to remind you about fiscal policy. Remember that fiscal policy is taxing and spending. In this unit, the concept of automatic stabilizers versus discretionary policy came up. And this is important because it brings a little layer of specificity to that fiscal policy term. That we want to be able to identify why or how things are changing with taxing and spending. Is this something that automatically kicks in, or is this something that's done to respond to an economic scenario or ideological purpose? We also learned a little bit more about budgets. This concept of deficit versus a balanced budget and also versus surplus. Remember that in vocabulary speaking, you want to make sure that you're saying that a budget is moving towards a deficit, moving towards a surplus, that we're not saying things like the budget is increasing or decreasing. We also learned that more often than not, governments are engaging in deficit spending where they lack the revenue to fund the spending projects because the tax revenue isn't enough to fund what we need to spend. And why isn't it enough to fund what we need to spend? Because in this class, we're studying macroeconomics. And a lot of macroeconomic work is helping an economy grow. And we often can't make the economy grow if we increase people's taxes so that we have money to put into those spending projects, right? So more often than not, we're trying to increase those spending projects and provide a tax cut to households in order to give them more disposable income, businesses more money to work with, and then also demand for labor through government spending. That's going to lead to deficits. What's going to happen because of that is that the government is going to borrow money. We also were reminded in this unit of something that we were introduced to in Unit 4, which is loanable funds, that we need to know who are the demanders of loanable funds and who are the suppliers. Remember that, households and businesses supply and demand. You know, I have a loan for a car and for a house, but I also have money that I'm saving in the bank. So there's an example of me functioning as both. But the demanders of loanable funds, the U.S. government, the Barrington government, the Rhode Island state government, we're all demanders of loanable funds. You know, there are a lot of projects that morally, ethically, or just because logistically they have to be done, money needs to be spent on something. And sometimes governments don't have the revenue, so they're going to have to borrow money. That's going to drive up the demand for loanable funds, and loanable funds is linked to real interest rates. So whenever you have a question that refers to real interest rates, chances are loanable funds are going to be part of it. The suppliers of loanable funds came up more in Unit 6 because we were looking at how foreign investors put money into bank accounts abroad in other countries. They don't care where it is. They just want their money to turn into more money. So they put their money into banks that have higher interest yields, and they are part of the suppliers of loanable funds. Because government deficit spending leads to an increase in loanable funds, we saw what can happen. We can see this concept of crowding out. So crowding out is a term that you certainly can use, but you do not want to assume that the person reading your test or your AP exam knows the definition. So you don't want to just say, oh, this will hurt economic growth because of crowding out. You need to explain what the term means. Because of deficit spending, this will drive up real interest rates. As a result of that, we're going to see in particular IG, which is part of aggregate demand, that investment in capital goods and technology is going to be discouraged because interest rates are higher. This could cause government spending to increase aggregate demand, and then the real interest rates could discourage aggregate demand to the point where we're right back where we started. But the cool thing about this is that this is why we have monetary policy, and monetary policy can come in and lower those interest rates should they feel as though the government borrowing is driving them up too much. So isolated in a vacuum, deficit spending is going to crowd out private investment. But then if we think about it, we have this monetary system there that can come in and sort of like put the fire out by splashing some cold water on it and keep those interest rates either what they were before or even lower them further. We also then learned about the Phillips curve. And remember that the Phillips curve is just a way to show the economy from a different vantage point. So I have a Phillips curve drawn ahead of time. So just remember the way it looks. Please, please, please. There's some people that are drawing graphs that are totally not the Phillips curve. You know, once in a while I'll get a graph like this and it looks like the, production possibilities curve. So please do not draw something that is not the short run Phillips curve. Know your graphs, number one. That's always going to get you a point. This graph shows the same economy as the PPC and the aggregate demand, aggregate supply. We can see a recessionary gap with a point that is to the right of full employment. All right, full employment here. And we also can see that inflationary gap on the inside of the long run Phillips curve. So inside starts with an I, thus inflationary gap. To the right of the long run starts with an R, thus recessionary gap. Remember that there are rules. If we have a demand shift, remember that's anything in C plus IG plus G plus XN, we demand to stay on the line. So if we had a demand shift, we'd be sliding to the right or to the left, just like we would on the actual demand curve to show that same, I said that wrong. We'd be sliding on the curve to show that same inverse relationship as the demand curve. The supply, on the other hand, remember what I taught you, we're going to supply a whole new line. And this comes down to knowing your supply shifters. Unlike it being C plus IG plus G plus XN, this is where we're talking about resource prices or productivity. So that's what's going to shift the short run Phillips curve. Remember with both of these, they move in opposite directions, right? So if you have a demand shift to the right, then you're shifting to the left on the line. A demand shift to the left, you're shifting to the right on the line. If resource prices come down and you're going to be shifting that short run aggregate supply to the right, then that means your short run Phillips curve would be shifting to the left. If productivity falls and all the technology is breaking down, let's say, or the workforce is becoming less educated and short run aggregate supply would shift to the left, then your short run Phillips curve would shift to the right. That is one of the biggest mistakes that students make, is not shifting the short run Phillips curve in the correct direction. Which brings me to the next point. Whether kids are asked about the short run aggregate supply or the short run Phillips curve, for some reason they get amnesia and they forget that we have two shifters. That's it. And they're already done for you. And kids are writing examples like, well, the short run aggregate supply or the short run Phillips curve would shift to the right or it would increase because it's got to get back to full employment. That's wrong. That's not an answer. Your answers come from either resource prices or productivity. So if resource prices are down, then that means that short run aggregate supply is going to increase and shift to the right because they can supply more. So what does that mean? The short run Phillips curve is going to decrease or shift to the left because we show it in the opposite direction. If resource prices are up, inflation is a problem, prices have gone up, short run aggregate supply is going to decrease. It's not going to be as easy to make stuff. Therefore, to show that in the opposite direction, the short run Phillips curve is going to shift to the right or increase. When you are required to share an answer, read the graph and talk about what happened with resource prices and how that impacts the ability to supply. All right? Now, sometimes you might have productivity. I'm not discounting that. But in my experience, more often than not, it's about resource prices. When you do want to comment about productivity, it's usually because real interest rates have fallen, and we're going to say that businesses are going to invest in technology and capital goods, and those things are going to lead to greater productivity, which is going to increase short-run aggregate supply, which would force the short-run Phillips curve to shift to the left. If you saw something that was a breakdown in productivity, technology fails, workforce is less educated.
Excuse the interruption.
A little interruption.
Anyone that is taking the makeup SAT tomorrow
So,
needs to be at school by 8:30.
this is my little review, and I'm sorry I'm being interrupted by that. I can't pause my recording.
And Cameron as soon as possible.
I'm going to cut it off.